Hello everyone, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
So my name is Jordan Durfee, and I am a master's student at the University of Hertfordshire studying English and literature. And today I will be talking to you about my paper titled Corruption as Agentic Power, a reading of The Villainess in Fantasy Media. And before beginning, I do just want to warn you that there will be mentions of sexual assault and also spoilers for the shows I will be discussing today. So power is often discussed as a means of agency, either the stripping of agency from someone or using it to reclaim agency for oneself. It is ultimately the ability to exert influence and control over yourself and others. The concept of power spreads through many facets of life: politics, interpersonal relationships, socioeconomic status, knowledge, money, and so much more. But in fantasy media, it often relates to something far more tangible. Power, in this case, refers to supernatural abilities such as magic or enhancements to normal human physiology such as superpowers. Oftentimes, there is a distinction between what is good and evil power within fantasy, rooted in the origins and use of said power. This paper will examine the use of dark power as a corruptive force through which women, the villainess for the purpose of this paper, gain autonomy and agency while also examining what pushed them to that choice to begin with. While not arguing the morality of these characters, nor necessarily justifying their choices and behavior, this paper will highlight the darker means that women in fantasy employ to maintain or gain control over their own lives. The characters this paper will examine are Leandra and Sedai from The Wheel of Time, specifically the television series produced and created by Amazon Prime Studios, and Morgana Pendragon from the BBC's Merlin. Both women exist within a fantasy world that has labels and rules for the use of magic that must be followed to stay good, and both of them break these rules and as such are labeled as villains by their respective societies and creators. In the case of The Wheel of Time, the magic system and origin of magic has very specific outlines for what is corrupt and what is not. Leandra utilizes the corrupted power to regain control of her life, pledging herself to darkness so that she is never again powerless and defenseless as she was in childhood. In Morgana's case, she lives in a world in which magic is outlawed, deemed evil simply for existing. Morgana utilizes magic, both good and evil magic, as labeled in universe, as a means of taking her life into her own hands so that she never has to submit to those who would punish her or harm her just because of who she is. Diving deeper into these two women will show that they willingly use corrupt practices to maintain control over their own lives. What started as a simple means of agentic power for them soon evolves beyond that, though remains rooted in their need for their own autonomy and perceived protection and justice for others, regardless of any other motivations they may have had to use these corrupt abilities. Ultimately, this paper is a study on the original choice that led to the use of corruption as an agentic force, and a small study of this archetype which can be found across fantasy media. Leandra and Sedai's origin parallels the fundamental concept of vigilante feminism, which can be described as, quote, violence against violence, a corrective action taken against those who harm girls and women. Boiling it down to its most simple form, vigilante feminism is the use of violence by girls and women as a means of justice when the systems in place have failed them, so long as their violence is proportionate to the crime committed. Being that societies across the world are largely patriarchal, the systems in place are designed in such a way that benefits men and harms and punishes women. Sexual violence is not only largely unpunished, but also normalized in such a manner that men get off without consequence and are given the chance to continue harming whomever they please. Such societies also commodify and objectify girls and women, stripping them of their autonomy with repeated sexual violence. While Leandra's actions eventually go beyond what is appropriately considered vigilante feminism, it's still important to know and understand the concept when looking at her origin. Furthermore, her origin is intricately tied to these societies and narratives that I've just mentioned. In Season 3, Episode 6, titled The Shadow in the Night, what had only been talked about thus far in the show is finally shown, and audiences could see the life that Leandra left behind. She was a child bride, roughly 13 years old, and we see her cradling her crying son, who was forced upon her by a man appearing to be in his 60s, if not older. As audiences watch Leandra attempt to soothe her son, the first thing we hear her say, voice shaking from pure fear and panic, is, "He won't want you screaming like that. He doesn't like screaming." The mentioned he, her husband, eventually arrives, right after she gets her son to calm down. He demands that Leandra give up her son to, quote, drown it. When the guard approaches, Leandra screams as the One Power, the magic system of this world, shoots from her and pierces straight through the skull of the man who wants to harm her son. As her husband then approaches her, his death follows in an identical fashion. Before taking her chance to flee, Leandra walks up to her husband and repeatedly stomps his head in while screaming. When she does flee, she meets Ishamael, an agent of the Dark One belonging to an order of eternal beings called the Forsaken. After begging for help, crying, covered in blood and dirt, but continually ignored, Ishamael's very gentle, "Would you like some help?" would be nearly impossible for anyone to ignore, let alone a child. While there's no denying she was also groomed into being an agent of the Dark One, it is important to acknowledge that at such a young age, she was already backed into a corner where the ultimate act of violence, murder, was her only option for safety and freedom. The first person to ever show her kindness was an agent of evil, and when that's the way you grow up, denying that corrupt power as a means of agency would prove quite difficult. To To further clarify the kind of corrupt power Leandrin uses, you need to know a bit about who that little girl became. Leandrin grew up to become an Aes Sedai, which is the order of women who can wield the One Power, and she specifically joins the Red Aja, who, quote, protect the world from people who would misuse the One Power, even other Aes Sedai. The first scene we see Leandrin in, she is hunting a man down who can channel, before gentling him, which is the process of binding his power so that he may never use it again. At this point in the world of the Wheel of Time, men who can wield are inherently corrupt. Thousands of years ago, a man called the Dragon corrupted the strand of One Power that men can channel, called Saidin. Now only women can wield their strain of the One Power, called Saidar, being uncorrupted, meaning Saidar is inherently pure. While the Red Aja is often characterized as the women who hate men, who find joy in binding and punishing them, Leandrin shows that it can be more than that. Leandrin insists that, quote, the Red Tent is open to all women, and continually uses her position in the Red Aja to extend small kindnesses to the women and girls she encounters. Ignoring the fact she also sold 3 of the leading women into slavery, she also offered them small ways to hold onto their power and escape in the same moment. Furthermore, in returning home and interrupting a wedding between an older man and his teenage bride, she eventually wiped the girl's memory to protect her from her trauma and her memories, the way Leandrin still has to deal with herself. And she does care very deeply when her fellow Aes Sedai are struck down by the false dragon. Yet, while in the ranks of the Aes Sedai, she was never truly bound by their oaths, working instead as an agent of the Dark One and the Forsaken. She ferried in as much death and destruction as she did small kindnesses, enacting a coup and nearly ending the life of the Amarlin seat, the woman in charge of the Aes Sedai. While groomed to use this corrupt power, and while continually choosing to operate as an agent of darkness, the origin of that choice is rooted in pain and a need for safety, where violence and corruption were her only means of protection from further marital and pedophilic rape. While she earned her title as a villainess, it's important to remember why, and look at the kind of power she continually chooses to engage with to maintain that position of power. By the end of Season 3, it is clear that Leandrin is gunning to become a Forsaken herself. Due to time constraints, we must move on to Morgana Pendragon from the BBC's Merlin. When we meet Morgana in the pilot episode, she is the ward of the king and a very gentle soul. She cares deeply for those she encounters, and she is shown to need the continual care of the court's physician to help her sleep and keep her sedated. However, audiences learn quickly that Morgana can speak out when she feels compelled, and that she can get away with it for the most part too. The first time we see Morgana rebel is Season 1, Episode 8, titled The Beginning of the End, and she's protecting a druid boy named Mordred. The druids are a group of people who Uther, the king, has almost completely slaughtered. All magic practitioners are put to death, but druids appear to be one of the bigger populations that Uther loathes. Despite being a pacifist people, Uther seeks to exterminate them. Even Arthur temporarily questions him, saying, quote, the druid was only in Camelot to collect supplies. He meant no harm. Is it really necessary to execute him? To which Uther responds, quote, absolutely necessary. Those who use magic cannot be tolerated. Mordred comes into Morgana's protection when Merlin brings him to her, knowing he can trust her and her discretion. Mordred is just a boy after all, innocent. Morgana does not hesitate to protect him, despite the threat of execution to herself, even choosing to be the one to physically escort him back to the druids, though they were caught before she succeeded. At this point, Morgana is not aware of her power, but she does feel a draw to Mordred and the druids, and she does not believe in their death for the sake of being magic users, which in the show, being a magic user is often interpreted as an allegory for queerness. Morgana persists, asking Uther, quote, what have these people done to you? Why are you so full of hate? She reaches out to touch his arm, and Uther, incensed, chokes her instead while Arthur watches. While Mordred was returned to his people and Morgana stayed in the castle, it truly was the beginning of the end and the start of her rebellion. Eventually, Morgana even flees to the druids for safety in a desire to be with her own people after her magic sets her room on fire in Season 2, Episode 3, The Nightmare Begins. Even just examining episode titles, when Morgana is one step closer to accepting and using her magic, the episode titles herald the end times. For those familiar with Arthurian legend, you may know that Morgana, also called Morgan, as simply as I get so much lore, is destined to be Arthur's enemy and end. The catalyst comes when Morgana learns that not only is she Uther's ward, but his illegitimate daughter. Furthermore, in Season 2, she meets her sister, Morgause, who introduces her to magic and starts her training between the Season 2 finale and Season 3's premiere, where it has been assumed Morgana has been kidnapped and missing for the past year. The seeds of Morgana's hatred had long been sown, for she had already plotted Uther's assassination back in Season 1, but when she learns she has the power to make a difference, she wants to protect all magic users. However, her version of protection is a royal coup and the killing of all those who stand in her way, including tearing Camelot down and building it back up again. If the foundation is rotten, doesn't one have to rebuild? In the interest of time, I will simply examine the turning point of it all, where she goes public with her rebellion. In the Season 3 finale, The Coming of Arthur, Morgana launches her coup with the backing of Morgause's Eternal Dark Army, in which she positions herself on the throne. Imprisoning or killing all who oppose her, Morgana's reign is dubbed one of terror by her subjects. She may aim to protect magic users and make Camelot a place of magic once more, but she has chosen to do so in a manner that harms the largest amounts of people, even innocents. In her mind, though, it's the only option left. Continually throughout the show, audiences see her stand up against Uther in every other way. She argues against him, she pledges her life in replacement of others, she works against him to protect people, but when that's not enough, where else can she turn? While the personal betrayal and the reuniting of her sister was the final catalyst, the origin of her choice to wield magic in such a deadly manner is still rooted in her own agency and the protection of a population that has faced genocide for decades. However, one of her first acts as queen is to fire upon and kill civilians under the guise of the execution of Arthur's knights. Having imprisoned Uther, he asks her why she turned against them, and she says, quote, "Surely you of all people must understand. Sometimes such measures are necessary." Uther continues, claiming that she killed innocents, which incites her rage as she says, quote, "As for so many that you put to death." She continues, telling Uther she wants him to understand what it is like to suffer and to, quote, "to know what it is like to be alone and afraid, to be disgusted with who and what you are," ending by telling him, "You cannot begin to know how much I hate you." It is hatred that ultimately corrupted Morgana, which was allowed to grow thanks to the policy of killing her people, for punishing her every time she tried to protect them, and for lying to her about her identity for all these years. Her father's hatred of her and her people created her own. After Morgana's death, Morgana truly steps into her own power and becomes the High Priestess. At this point, even her outfits have changed as she becomes more and more of the stereotypical evil witch. She lives in a cottage in the woods, her clothes are all black and tattered, her hair is no longer carefully maintained, and her actions are desperate and cruel, devoid of the gentle warmth she once possessed in spades. She launches another successful coup, then eventually a full-out invasion that ultimately claims the lives of Arthur and the majority of his round table. It also claims her own life, and it is Merlin who kills her. By the end of her story, she lost sight of why she wanted power, which was to unify the people and protect magic users. Her reason morphs into the fact that she deserves it, that it is hers by birthright. Now that she has the power, she instead uses it to hurt people by choice. While she's rightfully claimed the title of Villainess, the trajectory of how she got there is important to acknowledge. She was against genocide, against hurting people for being born different to societal norms, and she was against terror and fear. By the end, she was committing mass murder, her power became a selfish and corrupt thing, and she enacted her own reign of terror, which ultimately ended in her death. As I wrap everything up here today, I want to reiterate that many of the villainesses we know in media started off with good intentions or a desire for their own agency, and their fall to corruption is but a mere extension of that. Look at characters such as Daenerys Targaryen, specifically from the Game of Thrones show, and the way she was dubbed the Mad Queen by the end, or Ravenna from Snow White and the Huntsman, Regina Mills from Once Upon a Time, or Hama from Avatar: The Last Airbender, and so many more. You can even see this archetype in Greek mythology in figures like Medea, or in the reclamation of figures like Medusa and Circe. When examined closer, there's usually a reason women choose to utilize corrupt forces and step onto the path of evil, and that why is often rooted in the harm of patriarchal, heteronormative societies that are built on the foundations of inequality and the hurting of anyone who is not a white, cisgendered man. So really, are these villainesses as purely evil as they are portrayed, or is there a deeper story?